Okay, all right, super. So, so we'll go ahead and get started. So thanks everybody to coming to our third session here in Financially Fit February. I think that by this point, almost everyone has been here before. So just as a reminder to those maybe watching in the future online, I'm Tom Howard, member here at Grace, and regularly attend the 11 o'clock service, and put together some information to share with everyone tonight. Now, the topic of investments is an extremely broad topic, right? So, boy, as I was, kind of looking through this and trying to decide what to focus on, I thought, well, this could be 4 sessions on just this topic alone, and because there's so much to know, and also everyone's situation is so different when it comes to this. So really my goal here was to sort of go with information that I would call middle of the road. So for folks that are really experienced investors, I hope that there might be 1 or 2 things that you pick up tonight that'll be helpful pieces of information. For anyone who feels like they are kind of at the ground level of their knowledge, then this might be a little too quick and too fast to pick up on things, and for hopefully most folks that are in the middle will have some good content for you tonight. So anyway, along those lines, I thought this verse from Proverbs was a good one to start with. The heart of the discerning acquires knowledge, for the ears of the wise seek it out, right? And that's why we're here, I think, tonight, is to hopefully pick up some knowledge that ultimately is helpful, of course. Now, and that's the goal. Now, the second goal then, I think, for anybody is to take that information and to do something with it, right? So it doesn't necessarily do much good if it's only listened to and then not acted upon in any way. So I asked this question last time. So over the past couple of weeks, has anybody besides Linda gotten any information that they've acted on and been able to do something productive with? Oh, we got one more hand from Deb. Yep. Okay.
My son, the budget.
Right.
He wants to eventually move out, so he thought that was needed at his home.
There we go. Good. Okay. Excellent. So hopefully we can, keep going through information that is helpful and you can take action on. All right. So quick recap of our first couple of sessions. So first session a couple weeks ago was on self-evaluation and goal setting. I had a handout here that I handed out, and if anybody needs another copy of this, I have some extra copies I'm happy to share with you. But I think certainly important anytime you begin any sort of a process that you, know where you are currently. And I meant to use this graphic, so I just thought I'd throw it in tonight. I meant to use this graphic in that first session. So this is from about 15 years ago, I think. There was a study of Harvard MBA program graduates, or folks nearing their graduation from the Harvard MBA program. So presumably these are fairly smart and disciplined people. So when they surveyed these people, they found that 84% did not necessarily have really specific goals for what they were going to try to accomplish after the program. 13% then, with the gray section there, had some goals, but they were not written down, and 3% had clear goals that were written down. Right now, how do we think this shook out here? Probably pretty obvious, right? So the easiest way then to measure what they've done going forward from this point is financially. because we can pretty easily survey people and find that out. But it probably the same principle applies, not just to finances, but to other things as well. So anyway, the way the study came out was the people that had goals but didn't write them down, on average, were earning about twice as much as the people that had no goals written down. The people that did have goals written down were earning 10 times as much as the other 97 people. So again, it doesn't necessarily have to do with earning income, but just with anything that you're trying to do, if it is not written, when you write it down, the odds of doing it really go up, substantially. That's the point of this. Anyway, in our second session last week, we really focused on the foundation of financial planning, and 4 components there being having a good sense of your cash flow, having adequate savings, having the right protection elements in place, and then legal documents. On the protection side, that really goes to different types of insurances to have in place. On the legal side, there's a few documents that were generally agreed upon to be the 3 documents that you should have in place to not even just for your own financial stability, but really for your family's well-being. They'll really come in, very handy when they're needed most. And then finally, in the last session, we talked about some baby steps. So this is for someone who is maybe just starting out or maybe just starting over. And well, where do I begin with all these things? So I've got 8 baby steps here. And as anyone is looking through these, they might say, well, maybe I am good with most of these, but there's a couple on here that I need to try to accomplish. Well, these are in a suggested order, and if number 4 and number 6 are, for example, your priorities, then the general suggestion is you focus on 4 and then you focus on number 6 in this order. Or if you're starting from 0, then do number 1 and then number 2 and on down the list there. So again, if anybody who needs these things, happy to share them if you missed them from before. So that then takes me to my wrap-up verse here from Romans. At the end of the day, we need to take care of our debts, pay to whom we owe, ultimately respect who we owe, and then love our neighbors as well. And that's the overriding theme behind all of this, is by getting your finances in order, that it allows you then to focus on other pieces of life and be the best spouse, parent, sibling, friend, coworker that you can be. And when financial stress or other stresses are weighing you down, you're not able to probably be the best version of yourself in all those areas. So anyhow, now moving on to tonight's topic. Got a handout here. Thanks. Sure thing. There we go. Pass that one back. I'll just grab the extras there later on. All right, so topic of investments. Well, a lot of great life lessons and life skills come from Proverbs. So thought this one was an appropriate one to start with. Dishonest money dwindles away. Whoever gathers money little by little makes it grow. Right, probably a good place to start there. So, talking about some investment concepts. Who's heard of the rule of 72? Nobody? Okay. So rule of 72, important benchmark when we're talking about investments. So it goes like this. If you take 72, the number 72, and you divide it by a rate of growth, then that will tell you the number of years that it takes something to double in value, right? So it works out that if you have something that's growing at 10%, 72 divided by 10 will take about 7 years for something growing at 10% ultimately to double in value. Where 5%, something growing at 5% is going to take about 14 years to double in value. Okay? So then the way that works is not the way that we're usually good at thinking about these kind of things. So then on the back of page 1 here, thinking about how compound growth works. Let's say that we have $10,000. It grows by 10% over the course of a year. At the end of the year, we then have $11,000. We start the second year with $11,000. It grows by 10%. Now we have $12,100. We start the next year with $12,100. It grows by 10%. We then have $13,310. So in the first year, we had $1,000 of growth. In the second year, we had $1,100. In the third year, we had $1,210. And it's going to keep accelerating like that in this example. Okay? So the first question of the night for the audience. If you have $10,000, grows at 10% every year for 40 years. Take a guess how much you think that adds up to. Melissa, if you had to guess, what would you guess?
100,000.
100,000. John, what would you guess?
90,000.
Well, we got it surrounded. So the right answer, thanks, Jennifer, about $452,000. Right? $10,000 if it would grow 10% every year. $452,000 is what it would add up to. Right? So that's that compounding, really taking over. Now, if we have 10,000 and it grows by 5% each year, how much would that end up with after 40 years? If you had to guess, Jennifer.
225.
225 might be a good guess. Is that 70,000?
70,000.
Yeah. Right? So we think about this, right? Remember that first rule there. So if it's grown at 10%, it doubles every 7 years. So it doubled about 6 times. From 10 to 20 to 40 to 80 to 160 to 320. It keeps doubling every roughly 7 years. If it's at 5%, it takes 14 years to double. So it only doubles a couple times over the course of 40 years in that situation. So again, people aren't used to thinking this way. But when you graph those two, here's what they look like. This is 5% growth compounding versus 10% growth compounding, right? And as we're moving to the right here in the graph, that 10% line, you can see is really going up at a very sharp angle right there, right? Given more time, the 5% would start to curve up more and more also. Okay, so that's our first concept, compound growth. Right now, so that's the answer to the first 2 questions in the box, first 2 boxes. Now the next one. So again, we had that 10% growing, 10,000 growing at 10% for 40 years, ended up with 452,000. But if we have to pay some taxes on that, right? Let's say that 20% of your growth for easy math goes to taxes. So instead of growing at 10%, it only grows at 8%. Now you actually end up with 217,000. So that little bit of tax that you pay every year prevents it prevents the curve from going up so quickly, and you end up with about roughly half as much of invested at that point in time. So we're going to talk a little bit about strategies here in a bit, and the point is just that over a long period of time, taxes can really have a significant effect on how your investments perform. So I'll pause there for a second. Questions so far? You're doing pretty good? There's a few more numbers. I promise I did all the math for you. You don't need to pull out your calculators or take off your shoes. Okay, so anyway, so then here's the curve of the effect of taxes also, right? And that's 10% compounding growth versus 8% compounding growth over a long time. Okay, so next, the value of starting early. Now, as I look across the room, you know, we don't necessarily have a room full of people here who are starting early, but let's say that we had someone. They set aside $100 a month, $1,200 a year. They did that starting at age 25 going to age 40. And again, they were able to get that 10% growth, right? So that means that they invested $19,000 over the course of those 15 years. They ended up with about $467,000 than when they were 65. Now they contributed nothing, you know, out of their paycheck or out of their pocket after age 40. In this case, it just continued to sit. Okay, and that's what it adds up to, right? Now, if their neighbor sees that and they say, "Boy, I'm 40 now. I better get going." Right? I'm going to have to try to catch up because my neighbor started earlier here. So they said, "Well, I'm going to invest $200 a month, and I'm going to keep going until I'm 65." Right? See if I can catch up. The reality is they don't catch up. Right? So even investing twice as much for a longer period of time, 25 years, you end up with significantly less, right? So the value of starting early in savings and investings is enormous, right? So if you're not in a position, if you're not 25, maybe you know someone who's 25, right? I bet you can probably find someone who's 25, and I bet that you can maybe help to share some of these things with them, and they will certainly thank you for it in the future. So, questions about that? That's most of our math, I think. All right. So now, when we talk about investments, there's a whole lot of terminology. There's a whole lot of jargon. Okay, so I'll try to, address some basic things here. So, first I got 3 examples there of common securities, stocks, bonds, and funds, like mutual funds, for example. Now, the definition of a security is an investment that you have no real control over. Okay, so you buy a stock, you have no real effect on how that stock's going to do, probably. Okay, as opposed to, for example, investing in a business where you do have some control over what that does, right? So 3 most common types of securities: stocks, bonds, and funds. And then funds are groups, usually of all stocks, all bonds, or a mixture of the two. So a fund might have 100 different stocks in it, or it might have 75 different stocks and 25 bonds, for example, or vice versa. So funds are just collections of other things generally that make it easy for people to invest in and be diversified. And we'll talk about diversification again in a moment. So those are examples of securities. And then we have examples of accounts. So, we have 6 different types of accounts listed there. And these accounts can all have securities in them, or they can have basically cash inside of them, right? Now, each of these 6 things right here exists actually because they have different tax rules that are associated with them. So the tax rules for a traditional versus a Roth IRA, or an annuity, or just a brokerage account, right? So these are all different types of things from tax perspectives. I think sometimes people get confused about, what is what. But inside of each of those things, you have then the specific investments or the specific securities. So, questions about any of that? Yes, John?
What's a 529? I've never seen that before.
529 is a college savings plan. So parents, grandparents will set them up for their children. They have some nice tax advantages for using the money for higher education. But with all these things, then when the IRS gives you a break on it in some way, then they have real specific rules for how you can use it. So, but that's what a 529 is. It's again, you can use them for private high school as well, but generally a college savings plan. Yep. All right, I'll keep moving. Okay, so next concept, volatility. All right, so what do we think? Do we like the way that this investment is performing right here? Doesn't look too good, right? So this is just a snip of the S&P 500, which is basically a collection of the 500 largest companies in America. This is how they did last fall, essentially. Now, the baseline there is not zero. You kind of keep that in mind. So it wasn't going down to zero there. But you know, we certainly coming out of a volatile period pretty recently. Now, this is that. Here is that just expanded out a little further, right? How does it look now? Well, it doesn't look as bad. Now it's still negative if we look at, this is a 6-month time period, right? But I'll back up. You can see there I picked that very specifically, right, where it was sort of at the worst point. And then what happened? Came back up, right? So still negative, and that's why it was red on this graph. If I kind of zoom this out further, it now turns to green, and here is the 25-year trend, right? So how does that look? That looks okay, all right? So the point is here that when investing specifically in the stock market, you have volatility. Now, volatility is a short-term kind of problem, right? And especially if we're talking about the stock market, it's all stuff that just happens on paper, right? So I get a statement in the mail today and it says my account value is this. I don't literally get one tomorrow, but let's say I do, or I go online and check and it's moved. I go the next day, it's moved again. I go the next day, it's moved again. All right? So that volatility is happening on a short-term basis, certainly, but it really matters if you are taking the money out, right? So if it goes down and we say, okay, boy, I better take this all out. Well, then it's out, right? So in the middle of the chart right here, the last 25 or so years, is the drop in 2008, 2009, right? So people were moving along kind of steadily up there, and then we had really substantial drop. Right now, at that point, the emotional response to this is, uh-oh, this is bad. I'm scared. I better get out of here. Right? At that point in time, unless you absolutely had to have the money at that moment to use for something immediately, that was the worst thing to do, right? The best thing to do, and probably the harder thing to do, is say, okay, well, it's down here right now, right? But I know that it's going to come back. It's just a matter of how long it's going to take to come back, right? So the way that people lose money in investments is usually by acting emotionally. And they say, oh boy, stock market's doing great. I better get in. Well, wait a minute. It might be ready to go down, right? If it goes down, I better get out, all right? Where the opposite kind of logic would get you the best return, right? Or simply just staying in it for the long run with a well thought out strategy, is really the most prudent kind of advice. So, where's it going to be a year from now, right? It may be way up. It may be down, it may be the same, I don't know. Where's it going to be 25 years from now? I don't know that either, but it's reasonable to assume that we'll probably be going on a similar trajectory over a long period of time. But over a short period of time, no way to know whatsoever. So anyway, now the way to, again, really not fall into traps here is, number one, to just have a long-term understanding of how these concepts work, and then also to be well diversified. So this is the S&P 500, right? 500 stocks of 500 huge companies. If we look at any one of those companies in there, right, it might be up further, might have done a lot better or a lot worse. So any individual security, like a stock, for example, could have much more volatility and have much more risk. Could go up much more, could go down much more. But if we're looking at the market as a whole, and today a lot of people are really using mutual funds for a large portion of their investing, then it's spread out. Some things will be way up, some things will way down, but on average, they'll probably follow a trend similar to this. So, keep going. All right, so now I'm going to kind of go through an accumulation strategy. Now, you might remember from the other sessions that when I'm talking about accumulation strategy, what I'm really referring to generally here is people who are actively saving for the future, as opposed to distribution, where you're probably not actively saving for the future. Now we're using what we saved for such a long time, so generally being retired. So anyway, with accumulation, two main important points. Here we have vertical diversification and we have horizontal diversification. Now by vertical diversification, what I mean is we look at things on a scale from aggressive to safe, okay? And everything could fall somewhere on that spectrum. With, for example, maybe international growth stocks being something that's very aggressive and cash in the bank being something that is very safe, right? Now, to simplify this, we talk about assets that are above the line and refer to them as paper assets. Because like I said earlier, their value is going to rise and fall on paper. It's really what really matters is what the value is when those things are sold. Assets below the line refer to as real or stable. That's because their values typically don't decrease and they'll often earn some interest or dividends. Now, someone's personal allocation, meaning how much they have above and below the line, should be determined by factors like your age, risk tolerance, your time horizon, and overall goals and objectives. But generally speaking, the older you are, the more you should probably have below the line in most cases, right? Now, so that's looking at it vertically. Looking at horizontally, we have two sides here. We have pre-tax type of accounts, and we have after-tax types of accounts. So what's an example of a pre-tax type of account? Regular savings account is actually now, go on the right side, on the after-tax side.
Yeah, Roth IRA, 401k.
So your 401k is an example of a pre-tax plan. A traditional IRA, example of a pre-tax plan. So money goes into those before it's taxed, right? Pretty much everything else goes over on the right. Now, and also pensions would go on here, for example. Profit sharing plans for employers, for example. So anyway, for a long time, people like me have said that it's really best to, when you're accumulating, to focus on this pre-tax side and pump all that you can into a 401k or a deductible IRA or anything else considered pre-tax. Now, why do you think that was the recommendation?
You got more money invested that way.
Got more money invested because you were able to save on taxes. Exactly, right. Now that's a good short-term reason, but it's not actually the long-term reason why the strategy was successful for a lot of people, right? I'll start this sentence and see if anybody can fill in the blank. I want to defer taxes when I'm in my high income earning years, because when I pull the money out in retirement, I'll be in a what? A lower tax bracket, right? And for a long time that worked really well because of an evolution that's taken place. So these pre-tax plans were really written into the tax code in the 1970s, became popularized in the late 70s, early 80s. Now at that time, 1980, for example, take a guess what the top marginal tax rate was, or the top tax bracket in percent. So top tax bracket on a percentage basis was 70%. Okay? Now, to fall into that bracket, a couple would have to have income of $215,000 or more, but there were 15 brackets. Okay? So, if you made more money in a certain year, you could move up a bracket or two and pay an overall higher tax rate. If you made less money, or if you were able to take deductions by contributing to a plan like this, you could move down a bracket or two and pay a lower rate. Okay? Now today, so there were people that were able to avoid paying some tax in 50, 60, 70% ranges, and are today taking this money out at maybe a 22 or 24% bracket. So we're able to avoid paying taxes at a high rate and are now pulling that money out at a low rate. So today, top tax bracket or top tax rate is 37%. It's on income over $600,000, and there are 7 brackets. So they're spaced much farther apart, right? So now, where is it going to be in the future, right? In, 2050, for example, right? I don't know, right? But do we think that tax rates are going to be higher or lower in the future than they are today? Right?
You look at the presidential election, based on who wins, you know which way that's going to go.
Perhaps. The other factor, so there's a political climate involved there. There's also the fact that we have a growing national debt, right? And at some point, a lot of people are predicting, and I don't know, but a lot of people are predicting that rates will have to go up at some point in the future. If you look at it from a historical perspective, we're in a very low tax environment right now. So if rates go up in the future, people could be avoiding paying relatively low tax rates now, and if they contribute to these plans, then they could pull that money out and be paying higher tax rates in the future. So, for that reason, this horizontal diversification has gotten more attention recently. People say, well, okay, it makes sense to have some investments on each side of this tax fence. So that's where something like, I heard earlier, a Roth IRA comes into place, okay? Now, for people that still have a lot of years left to accumulate that are far from retirement, it may not make sense to have anything down in this box because these safe investments, this is for someone who's 20, 30, 40, maybe even 50 years old, these safe investments aren't going to get the return that the more aggressive ones will. Now, they'll have more volatility along the way, but if you're not going to be touching this money for quite some time, then it might not make sense to have any of it on this side safe, right? Now, where it does certainly make sense to have safe money, depending on your age, is down here in this box. So in this box we have cash, we have bonds, for example, CDs, fixed deferred annuities, cash value life insurance, for example. So these are places to have, these are good places to have safe investments. They're going to be less volatile, and again, for a younger person, it makes sense to have these things over here on the after-tax side. So when designing an overall strategy for people who are accumulating, we're going to look at how much it makes sense to have in each box, and then build a strategy around that to achieve goals. So, questions about any of those concepts? All right. Now, next thing. So then let's think about if we're not in the accumulation stage, if we're in the distribution stage, right? So in distribution, we have a whole different paradigm. So the first consideration is how much income do we need? Now, there are a couple of sources of guaranteed income, like Social Security or a pension, for example. But if you need to take money from retirement accounts, how much is it safe to take out, right? Well, I don't know if you're able to read this chart here, but there was a recent study that showed that if somebody has a portfolio that's 60% stocks, 40% bonds, and they withdraw 4% of their portfolio each year, then there's a 65% chance that the assets will last 30 years. 35% chance they won't last that long. Okay? So the answer is we really don't know, and it depends on how all these individual investments do. So how much is it safe to withdraw? Well, the less you withdraw, the safer the account is. If we're getting down to where you are withdrawing 9 or 10% of the balance, there's almost no chance that it's going to last 30 years in that situation, right? So, then really in somebody who's in that distribution phase, we're going to look at how much income they need. What are their guaranteed sources? So how much do they have coming from Social Security? Do they have income from a pension? And if they need more income than what those things provide, then looking at their overall portfolio, we'll say, okay, well, there's a certain percentage, and it might be bigger than this or smaller than this piece of the pie here, but how much they need to set aside really just for income. And then we can build a portfolio with that in mind. Can also look at income annuity options at that time to make it guaranteed. And then of the remaining funds, we want to have, probably some percentage invested aggressively, another invested safe, and then part of that safe should probably be in cash. So how much of, what anybody's individual allocation there should be is depending on a lot of factors that I can't possibly try to explain tonight. It's all done on really an individual kind of basis. But at any rate, there are really 4 main risks, I think, that people run into in retirement. First one is just longevity. We don't know, how many years we need to make this money last for. Next is inflation, so that can obviously erode purchasing power. Healthcare expenses can certainly put a real squeeze on whatever planning we put in place. And then the last one is called sequence of return risk. And what that means can't really explain it all today, but basically the order of your returns, how much they go up and down each year, doesn't really matter as you're accumulating, but when you go to pull money out, it makes a big difference. So if you're taking money out of an account when it's down, that has a compounding downward kind of effect, is the point there. So, and I think I'm on the back page here. So, solutions for these risks may make sense to look at having more guaranteed income. So there are strategies for having income guaranteed. Strategy for dealing with inflation is we want to have probably some things that are invested aggressively. Strategy for healthcare is if a person can qualify and it makes sense to their overall situation, having some long-term care insurance in place. Also, there are ways you can do things through the legal system to help with that. So, makes sense to generally, I think, to speak with an attorney if that's something that you're really concerned about, and most people probably should have a good feeling of how that works or a good idea of how that works. And then a sequence of returns. So again, having guaranteed income and not being not relying on investment returns for income is often a good strategy. And then finally, rebalancing. So what I mean by this is, depending on any given year, depending on how you're aggressive, or if you look at it the other way, depending on what your above the line does. Let's say that there's a person that you decide that you're fairly conservative and you want to have 75% aggressive invested conservatively and 25% invested aggressively. This is aggressive and conservative or safe. Okay? If your aggressive investments do really well in a given year, then you might get up to 35 and 65, and your overall portfolio value is up in this situation. Okay? So, what should we do then? What we should probably do then is rebalancing would say we should sell off some of this, put it back down here to get back down to a 25-75 mix. So we should take our gains, sell high, and get back to original position, okay? Conversely, if the next year those investments don't do very well, and then you're at 20 and 80 because the value dropped that year, what we should probably do then is take some of this, put it back up there, because then we have an opportunity to buy low, all right? So by having a clear idea of what percentage we want where, and looking at that probably on an annual basis, you can take that emotion out of it. Because the emotion will say, this is doing bad, maybe I should get out of it. The reality is you may want to do the opposite and get more of it when the price is low. Conversely, when things are going well, you may not want to sell, right? But that's your opportunity to sell high and take some of those gains and get back to your overall position right there. So that's the concept of rebalancing. Questions about any of those things? All right. So that's the content for tonight. So the next question is, you have to answer to yourself is, should you take any action based on everything that you learned tonight? And action might be making some move, implementing some strategy, or it might just be talking to someone because I've confused you more than helped you at this point in time. But if you think you should take any action, then I would suggest that you write that down, right? And give yourself a deadline. So that's the point of our chart here on the back. And then if I can do anything to help, please let me know. So the whole reason for this doing this series here is, to be of help to people. And if we can, do things that have us achieve more stability or more fitness in our finances, then again, it really gives us the chance to be that best parent, spouse, friend to others, and then I, also think that it's good for Grace here, because with more stability, and we're able to give more confidently as well. So that's it for tonight. What's that? And so next week we are going to talk about some more specific systems to put in place, right? So my hope is that through the series that you have learned some good information, right? But we're in February now, so this was really a good topic for especially early January. So the busiest day, for example, at the gym is probably January 2nd, right? And now towards the end of February, it's probably fallen off some, right? Now the people who are successful there probably had a system. And a lot of times you have good ideas about doing things, but without systems to make them happen, it's easy for those good intentions to fall by the wayside. So topic next week goes around systems for doing some of these things. So
They're putting these on the church website?
that's what I've been told. So I don't know. I haven't looked myself, but I at least one person told me that they watched it online.
Well, I can't
So,
be here
yeah.
next week, that's why.
Yeah. All right. Other questions? Well, I'm happy to hang around for a little bit this evening. If there's anything that I can help you with, please, reach out to me outside of this, or happy to answer any questions that I can. But thanks for coming out tonight, folks. Have a nice evening.
Thank